The true light that enlightens every man who's coming into the world, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. You may be seated. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Very good. It is still Christmas all the way up through January 5th. And it's the Christmas season, which continues all the way to February 2nd, to the Feast of Presentation. So keep those things in mind and celebrate accordingly. This is the time for feasting. But whenever I think about the Christmas feast, liturgically speaking, I always feel like it sort of gets the short end of the stick. It's not celebrated in any way with the same liturgical gusto that it used to be. And at least liturgically, Easter really gets the brunt of the liturgical celebration these days. If you think about it, you know, we all want to come out for the Easter Triduum, the great 3 days. Everyone comes to Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday, and Easter Vigil, and then the Easter morning, of course. And a lot of people don't even realize that Christmas itself also sort of has its own Triduum, its own 3 days. They often get overlooked by almost everyone. And if you understand this sort of Christmas Triduum, you'll understand why Christmas is the only feast that is a 12-day feast. So, of course, we celebrate the Nativity of our Lord on December 25th. We all know that already. But a lot of people don't realize that that's immediately followed by 3 different feast days that come immediately after, on the 26th, the 27th, and 29th. And those feast days are the Feast of St. Stephen, the first martyr, the Feast of St. John the Evangelist, and then finally the Feast of the Holy Innocents, the children who were killed in Bethlehem after the Holy Family had fled. These feast days aren't just your regular old run-of-the-mill saints' days. Instead, these saints' days have been put on these days intentionally as an extension of the Christmas celebration. Each of these feast days are fundamentally Christmassy. And they give the reason that Christmas itself is a 12-day feast. So Christians celebrate all of their feast days for what's called an octave, 8 days. Because, of course, the world was created in 7 days, and then the recreation of the world, which is the resurrection, gives it an 8th day. And so we celebrate, in a sense, an 8-day week that overlaps on Sundays. And so we celebrate all of our feasts for 8 days. And so the Feast of the Nativity is on December 25th, celebrated for 8 days until January 1st. And then overlapped with that, on the next day, on the 26th, is the Feast of St. Stephen, which is also celebrated for 8 days. And then after that, the Feast of St. John, celebrated for 8 days, and the Feast of the Holy Innocents, celebrated for 8 days. And then once you get to the first, each of those kind of ends on their 8th day as you cool off. And so those 4 days of Christmas feasts all compile together to sort of form this sort of a flat-topped pyramid of a feast. And so that's what gives Christmas its 12 days. So far from being just sort of added on saints' days, these saints' days are fundamental to understanding liturgically what's happening on Christmas. And I personally believe that they should be celebrated with as much gusto as we celebrate Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and the Easter Vigil. These great 3 days, the Christmas Triduum. And so today and this week, I want to kind of look at all of these Christmas feasts. Today we're going to look at the Feast of St. John, of St. Stephen, of St. John, and of the Holy Innocents. We'll learn what they have to do with Christmas and how they can affect us personally in our own spiritual use of this season. And then next week, we're going to look at the Feast of the Circumcision, which is also called the Feast of the Holy Name, and learn what that has to do with Christmas and how we can appropriate that spiritually as well. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Let's talk about the very first day, the Feast of St. Stephen, the very first martyr. Now here we are, right? We're celebrating Christmas. We've got the tree up. We've got the lights on. We've got cookies in the oven. The kiddos are all having a good time opening toys. And we're all having a joyous time, right? And the last thing that we want is for someone to rain on our parade. Because Christmas is such a joyous and festive season, right? And then we get to December 26th, and the church does what? It sort of slaps us in the face liturgically with the celebration of a martyr, of the very first martyrdom of the church. Now, what on earth could this be? I think that the first and most obvious answer is this. Do you remember last week how we talked about typology, how there were types in the Old Testament that sort of were types of Christ? They pointed to the future fulfillment that Christ would bring. We also talked about how that goes in the opposite direction, how we're all supposed to, in a sense, be types of Christ. Well, St. Stephen really exemplifies that type of Christ in his life, especially in his martyrdom. If you read the story of the martyrdom of St. Stephen in Acts chapter 7, you'll see he preaches to the Sanhedrin, and he goes through all of this Old Testament foreshadowing, all these types of Christ, and shows how the whole Old Testament points to Jesus Christ as the Messiah. And his hearers become so frustrated realizing that they've crucified the Messiah that they take it all out on St. Stephen. And they drag him out into the courtyard and they stone him. And as St. Stephen is being stoned, he does this wonderful thing. And he prays for the salvation of his persecutors. Which is very much like Christ himself, right? Who, in the very midst of being crucified, does what? He prays, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. St. Stephen, then, is this type of Christ who points back to Jesus Christ and to Christ's crucifixion. I think that this is extremely important for the Christmas season because of this. Because Jesus Christ was not born without a trajectory. You know, when you shoot an arrow, you have to aim that arrow at a target first. And the second you let go of that arrow, it has a predetermined trajectory that determines where it's going to end up. And in the same sort of a way, when Jesus Christ was born, the very moment he became incarnate, his entire life had a trajectory. And that entire trajectory ended on the cross. Jesus Christ was born in order to be crucified, to suffer and die for the sake of the whole world. And we have this feast of St. Stephen to remind us of this fact. But not only that, I think that there's more to it. The feast of St. Stephen doesn't just remind us that in the incarnation, the crucifixion is implied. But it also teaches us that, in a sense, in the crucifixion, in the incarnation, our own crucifixions are also implied. Jesus Christ said to pick up your cross and to follow me. St. Paul said daily that we should mortify our flesh. And it's a reminder that as Jesus came into the world and was so persecuted and suffered and died for the sake of the world, so we ourselves too are called to that very same thing. We ourselves are called to martyrdom. We are called to that extreme vocation. And we are called to prepare ourselves for that possibility and for that end. Our baptism in Christ is a reminder that when we are baptized in Christ, we give our whole selves over to him as he has given his whole self over to us. And this lesson which is given to us in the Feast of St. Stephen is fundamental to the very lesson of the Incarnation that all of us are to learn from. So we learn in St. Stephen that St. Stephen was a martyr in both will and deed. And that this martyrdom is the martyrdom of Christ made evident in St. Stephen. And that same martyrdom should make itself evident in our own lives as well. Now, secondly, as we move on from St. Stephen, we come to the feast of St. John the Evangelist. Now, the church always developed a way of speaking about these three martyrdoms in a row here a certain way. As we just mentioned, St. Stephen was martyred in both will and deed. He willed to be martyred, and he was indeed martyred. But if you look around the world around you, I think you'll find that that's not the typical trajectory of most of our lives. We may be called to be willing to be martyrs, but the vast majority of us don't actually face in actual physical martyrdom, real threats to our life in the shedding of our blood. And so, along the lines of that example, we have also St. John the Evangelist, who was willing to be martyred, but nonetheless, it never actually came about. Oh, they tried. They tried to martyr St. John the Evangelist. You may not know this, but St. John the Evangelist was the only apostle who was not martyred. And they attempted to martyr him. You may have heard the story of St. John at the Lateran Gate, where they drug him before the authorities, and the Romans tried to kill him by boiling him in a vat of hot oil. But when they put him in the vat of hot oil, it ended up not doing anything. It was just like a water bath for him. And he miraculously survived. That, my friends, is why St. John the Evangelist was exiled to the island of Patmos. Because they said to themselves, we tried killing him. It didn't work. So I guess the best thing that we can do is just to exile him where he can't be a bother to us anymore. And so that's what happened to St. John. So we can see that as St. Stephen was a martyr in both will and deed, St. John became a martyr in will, but not in deed. And so in that sort of a way, his life lines up very well with the rest of our own lives. But I think I have to ask the question, how much is martyr in will something that really exemplifies who we are? If we need to be willing to be martyrs for Christ, even if it never actually comes down to that, how then should we be living our lives? I don't think that martyrdom is something that you can just walk into unprepared. If that extreme was called upon you this day, if you were called to fulfill that vocation, would you be able to do it? The entire liturgical life of the church is there to give us a way and a means of establishing that will within us. It is a way of helping us to strengthen that determination to give our whole entire lives to Christ. And I don't know about you, but I think that we are very unlikely to give our lives for Christ if we can't even drag our sorry rear ends out of bed in the morning to sit in a pew for an hour. If we can't say morning and evening prayer, if we can't read our scriptures, if we can't fast on Fridays and in Lent and so on and so forth, if we can't even give this to the Lord, how could we give our very lives? And so the very life of St. John the Evangelist is a call for us to give all, to put our entire wills and our entire actions into the spiritual disciplines of the church so that we can be formed into something that's greater than we are today. And so in St. Stephen, we learn about the trajectory of Christ's life and the trajectory of our own vocation in martyrdom. In St. John, we learn that even if that martyrdom doesn't come, that we should prepare our hearts and our wills for such an end. And then finally, we have the last lesson in the Holy Innocents. The Holy Innocents were those poor children who you probably remember the story when Jesus Christ was born into Bethlehem. The wise men came to Herod, and they said to Herod, we've seen the star of the Messiah in the east, and we've come to worship him. And Herod says, I didn't know about this. How long has the star been there? And Herod finds out where the Messiah is supposed to be born, and he tells them Bethlehem. And so he tells to the wise men, he says, now go and worship him, and when you're done, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too. Of course, his intention was not to go and worship. He saw Christ as competition for the throne. And so his determination was to go and to kill the Christ child instead of to worship. And so when the wise men had gone to worship, the Lord sent the wise men a dream to not go back to Herod and to go back in a different way. And then a dream to Joseph and Mary to say to get out of town because trouble was coming. And when Herod realized that he'd been duped by the wise men, he went to the most extreme and most horrific extreme that he possibly could. Instead of just trying to kill the Christ child, he killed every single child in the region of Bethlehem, under 2 years old. An absolutely horrific event. And it helps us to realize just the stark horror that the ancient world could be without the rule of law as we appreciate it and enjoy it today. But this is, of course, it's obviously connected with the Christmas story itself, but I believe that it has another message for us today as well. You know, a lot of us, I think, when we hear that story, it may be easiest for us to think to ourselves, oh, well, how terrible. The Christ child got off scot-free and all these others had to suffer instead. But I think if we think about it that way, I think we've come about it with some really poor theology. Because as I've said before, Jesus Christ didn't just come to become a human. He didn't just incarnate a singular human being in the first century. Rather, he came to take upon himself the entirety of our human nature. He became, in a sense, the whole of humanity. Now let it sink in what that means. What that means is that Jesus Christ didn't just die once upon a cross, but that he felt every single stab that every single child in Jerusalem felt that day. He cried every single tear that every single mother cried in Bethlehem that day. He screamed every single scream that every father cried in Bethlehem that day. And not only that, but we can extend it out even further, that every single tear that you have ever cried, every single pain that you have ever felt, every single scream that you've ever screamed has not only been yours, but his just as much. The message of the incarnation is that God did not remain distant in our suffering, but came close, came near, came to suffer in our midst, came to suffer as one of us, nay, to suffer as us, and to take our sufferings upon him. True love doesn't stand at a distance when others suffers. True love comes close. And that, my friends, is the very message of the incarnation. That God himself has come near to our sufferings. To be a light that shines in the darkest places. To be nearer to us than we are to ourselves. And in that inner place to shine a light in our darkness. And the more we find that light, the more we contemplate that light, the more we hold on to that light, the more we become a part of that light, the lighter our world gets. And the lighter our world gets, the lighter the world around us becomes. And that, my friends, is the message of Christmas. Not just the happy, cozy, comfy, easy parts of it, but the real deep message that God himself has come to confront suffering face to face and to be there in the midst of it for the sake of redemption. And so this is what we learn, my friends, from the Christian Triduum. Not just that Christ has come, but that Christ has come to take the sufferings of the world upon himself, to be crucified for our sakes, and that we ourselves are to become a part of that very trajectory and a part of that very action. That we are to do it by forming our wills to his will through the disciplines of the church. And not only that, but we have come through these feasts to learn that Christ is with us in our sufferings and suffers with us and redeems us in the midst of them. And so, my friends, I would encourage you to make the most of this Christmas season. And next year, when these feast days come around, come on out and join us. We will have Mass on each of those days. And there's no better way to appreciate these festivals and their meanings than to celebrate the Mass in the honor of each of them. The true light that enlightens every man was coming into the world. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.